The Eastern Catholic Churches, also historically known as the Eastern-rite Catholic Churches or Uniate Churches, are 23 particular churches iuris in full communion with the Pope of Rome, which make up the Catholic Church together with the Latin Church. Liturgies of the 23 Eastern Catholic Churches include the Byzantine, Alexandrian, Armenian, East Syrian, and West Syrian rites. Traditions shared with other Eastern Christian churches, the Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and the Church of the East, although some theological issues divide them from other Eastern churches. They do admit members of these latter churches to the Eucharist and the other sacraments as governed by Oriental canon law. As a result of emigration from their original regions in the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe and India, Eastern Catholics have spread to Western Europe, the Americas and Oceania, where eparchies have been established alongside Latin Church dioceses. Terminology. Although Eastern Catholics are in full communion with the Pope and are members of the larger Catholic Church, they are not members of the Western or Latin Church, which uses the Latin liturgical rites, among which the Roman Rite is the most widespread. Rite or church. There are different meanings of the word rite. Apart from its reference to the liturgical patrimony of a particular church, the word has been and is still sometimes, even if rarely, officially used of the particular church itself. Thus the term Latin Rite can refer either to the Latin Church or to one or more of the Western liturgical rites, which include the majority Roman Rite but also the Ambrosian Rite, the Mozarabic Rite, and others. In the 1990 Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches, the terms autonomous church and rite are thus defined: a group of Christian faithful linked in accordance with the law by a hierarchy and expressly or tacitly recognized by the supreme authority of the church as autonomous is in this code called an autonomous church. A rite is the liturgical, theological, spiritual and disciplinary patrimony, culture and circumstances of history of a distinct people, by which its own manner of living the faith is manifested in each autonomous church. The rites treated in CCEO, unless otherwise stated, are those that arise from the Alexandrian, Antiochian, Armenian, Chaldean and Constantinopolitan traditions. When speaking of Eastern Catholic Churches, the Latin Church's 1983 Code of Canon Law uses the terms ritual church or ritual church iuris, and also speaks of a subject of an Eastern rite or ordinaries of another rite, the faithful of a specific rite, etc. The Second Vatican Council spoke of Eastern Catholic Churches as particular churches or rites. In 1999, the United States National Conference of Catholic Bishops stated, "We have been accustomed to speaking of the Latin Rite of the Eastern rites to designate these different churches. However, the Church's contemporary legislation as contained in the Code of Canon Law and the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches makes it clear that we ought to speak, not of rites but of churches." Canon 112 of the Code of Canon Law uses the phrase autonomous ritual churches to designate the various churches, and a writer in a periodical of January 2006 declared, "The Eastern Churches are still mistakenly called Eastern Rite Churches, a reference to the various liturgical histories. They are most properly called Eastern Churches, or Eastern Catholic Churches." However, the term rite continues to be used. The 1983 CIC forbids a Latin bishop to ordain, without permission of the Holy See, a subject of his who is of an Eastern rite. Pope Benedict XVI wrote in his 2007 Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum that any Catholic priest of the Latin rite, under certain conditions, may use either edition of the Roman Missal, Uniate. The term Uniate or Uniate applies to Eastern Catholic Churches previously part of Eastern or Oriental Orthodox Churches or of the Assyrian Church of the East. The term is considered to have a derogatory connotation, though it was occasionally used by Latin and Eastern Catholics prior to the Second Vatican Council. Official Catholic documents no longer use the term due to its perceived negative overtones. According to John Erickson of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, the term Uniate itself, once used with pride in the Roman Communion, had long since come to be considered as pejorative. Eastern-rite Catholic also was no longer in vogue because it might suggest that the Catholics in question differed from Latins only in the externals of worship. The Second Vatican Council affirmed rather that Eastern Catholics constituted churches whose vocation was to provide a bridge to the separated churches of the East. History. Background. Communion between Christian churches has been broken over matters of faith, whereby each side accused the other of heresy or departure from the true faith. Communion has been broken also because of disagreement about questions of authority, of the legitimacy of the election of a particular bishop. In these latter cases each side accused the other of schism, but not of heresy. Major breaches of communion. First Council of Ephesus. In 431 the churches that accepted the teaching of the First Council of Ephesus classified as heretics those who rejected the council's statements. The Church of the East, which was mainly under the Sassanid Empire, never accepted the council's views. It later experienced a period of great expansion in Asia before collapsing after the Mongol invasion of the Middle East in the 14th century. Monuments of the presence still exist in China. Now they are relatively few in numbers and are divided into three churches, of which the Chaldean Church, which is in communion with Rome, is the largest, while the others have recently split between the Assyrian Church of the East and the Ancient Church of the East. Council of Chalcedon. In 451 those who accepted the Council of Chalcedon similarly classified those who rejected it as monophysite heretics. The churches that refused to accept the council considered instead that it was they who were orthodox. They reject the description monophysite, preferring instead miaphysite. They are often called, in English, Oriental Orthodox churches, to distinguish them from the Eastern Orthodox churches. This distinction, by which the words Oriental and Eastern that in themselves have exactly the same meaning but are used as labels to describe two different realities, is impossible to translate in most other languages, and is not universally accepted even in English. These churches are also referred to as pre-Chalcedonian and are more rarely as non-Chalcedonian or anti-Chalcedonian. In languages other than English, other means are used to distinguish the two families of churches. Some reserve the term Orthodox for those that are here called Eastern Orthodox churches, but members of what are called Oriental Eastern Orthodox churches consider this illicit. East-West Schism. The East-West Schism came about in the context of cultural differences between the Greek-speaking East and Latin-speaking West, and of rivalry between the churches in Rome, which claimed a primacy not merely of honor but also of authority, and in Constantinople, which claimed parity with Rome. The rivalry and lack of comprehension gave rise to controversies, some of which appear already in the Acts of the Quinisext Council of 692. At the Council of Florence, these controversies about Western theological elaborations and usages were identified as, chiefly, the insertion of filioque into the Nicene Creed, the use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist, purgatory, and the authority of the Pope. The schism is conventionally dated as occurring at 1054, when the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael I Cerularius, and the papal legate, Humbert of Silva Candida, issued mutual excommunications. In 1965 these excommunications were revoked by both Rome and Constantinople. In spite of that event, for many years both churches continued to maintain friendly relations and seemed to be unaware of any formal or final rupture. However, estrangement continued to grow. In 1190, Eastern Orthodox theologian Theodore Balsamon, who was Patriarch of Antioch, wrote that no Latin should be given communion unless he first declares that he will abstain from the doctrines and customs that separate him from us. Later, Constantinople was sacked in 1204 by the Catholic armies of the Fourth Crusade, whereas 2 decades previously the massacre of the Latins had occurred in Constantinople in 1182. Thus, by the 12th–13th centuries, the two sides had become openly hostile, each considering that the other no longer belonged to the church that was Orthodox and Catholic. Over time, it became customary to refer to the Eastern side as the Orthodox Church and the Western as the Catholic Church, without either side thereby renouncing its claim to be the truly Orthodox of the truly Catholic Church. Attempts at restoring communion within each church, no longer in communion with the Church of Rome, there arose a group that considered it important to restore the communion. In 1438, the Council of Florence convened, which featured a strong dialogue focused on understanding the theological differences between the East and West, with the hope of reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Several Eastern churches associated themselves with Rome, forming Eastern Catholic Churches. The See of Rome accepted them without requiring that they adopt the customs of the Latin Church, so that they all have their own liturgical, theological, spiritual and disciplinary heritage, differentiated by people's culture and historical circumstances, that finds expression in each iuris church's own way of living the faith. In 1993, the Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church submitted the document, Uniatism, Method of Union of the Past and the Present Search for Full Communion, also known as the Balamand Declaration, to the authorities of the Catholic and Orthodox Churches for approval and application, which stated that initiatives that led to the union of certain communities with the See of Rome and brought with them, as a consequence, the breaking of communion with the mother churches of the East, took place not without the interference of extra-ecclesial interests. Likewise, the Commission acknowledged that certain civil authorities made attempts to force Eastern Catholics to return to the Orthodox Church, used unacceptable means. The missionary outlook and proselytism that accompanied the union was judged incompatible with the rediscovery by the Catholic and Orthodox churches of each other as sister churches. Thus the Commission concluded that the missionary apostolate, which has been called Uniatism, can no longer be accepted either as a method to be followed or as a model of the unity our churches are seeking. At the same time, the Commission stated that Eastern Catholic churches, being part of the Catholic communion, have the right to exist and to act in response to the spiritual needs of the faithful, that Oriental Catholic churches, which desired to re-establish full communion with the See of Rome and have remained faithful to it, have the rights and obligations connected with this communion. Emergence of Eastern Catholicism. Most Eastern Catholic churches arose when a group within an ancient church in disagreement with the See of Rome returned to full communion with that see. The following churches have been in communion with the Bishop of Rome for a large part of their history. The Maronite Church, which has no counterpart in Byzantine nor Oriental Orthodoxy. The Maronite Church has historical connections to the monothelite controversy in the 7th century. It affirmed unity with the Holy See in 1181 during the Crusades. The Italo-Albanian Catholic Church, unlike the Maronite Church, uses the same liturgical rite as the Eastern Orthodox Church. The canon law shared by all Eastern Catholic Churches (CCEO) was codified in 1990. The dicastery that works with the Eastern Catholic Churches is the Congregation for the Oriental Churches, which by law includes as members all Eastern Catholic patriarchs and major archbishops. Orientalium Dignitas. On 30 November 1894, Pope Leo XIII issued the Apostolic Constitution Orientalium Dignitas, in which he stated, "The churches of the East are worthy of the glory and reverence that they hold throughout the whole of Christendom in virtue of those extremely ancient, singular memorials that they have bequeathed to us. For it was in that part of the world that the first actions for the redemption of the human race began, in accord with the all-kind plan of God. They swiftly gave forth the yield, the flowered in first blush, the glories of preaching the true faith to the nations, of martyrdom and of holiness. They gave us the first joys of the fruits of salvation. For them has come a wondrously grand and powerful flood of benefits upon the other peoples of the world, no matter how far-flung. When blessed Peter, the prince of the apostles, intended to cast down the manifold wickedness of error and vice, in accord with the will of heaven, he brought the light of divine truth, the gospel of peace, freedom in Christ, to the metropolis of the Gentiles." Adrian Fortescue read that Leo XIII begins by explaining again that the ancient Eastern rites are a witness to the apostolicity of the Catholic Church, that the diversity, consistent with unity of the faith, is itself a witness to the unity of the Church, that they add to her dignity and honor. He says that the Catholic Church does not possess one rite only, but that she embraces all the ancient rites of Christendom. Her unity consists not in a mechanical uniformity of all her parts, but on the contrary, in the variety according in one principle and vivified by it. Leo XIII declared still in force Pope Benedict XIV's encyclical De Mandatum, addressed to the Patriarch and the bishops of the Melkite Catholic Church, in which Benedict XIV forbade Latin Rite clergy to induce Melkite Catholics to transfer to the Latin Rite, and he broadened this prohibition to cover all Eastern Catholics, declaring, "Any Latin Rite missionary, whether of the secular or religious clergy, who induces with his advice or assistance any Eastern Rite faithful to transfer to the Latin Rite, will be deposed and excluded from his benefice, in addition to the ipso facto suspension ad divinis and other punishments that he will incur as imposed in the aforesaid Constitution De Mandatum." Second Vatican Council. There had been confusion on the part of Western clergy about the legitimate presence of Eastern Catholic Churches in countries seen as belonging to the West. Despite firm and repeated papal confirmation of these churches' universal character, the Second Vatican Council brought the reform impulse to visible fruition. Several documents from both during and after the Second Vatican Council have led to significant reform and development within Eastern Catholic Churches. Orientalium Ecclesiarum. The Second Vatican Council directed in Orientalium Ecclesiarum that the traditions of Eastern Catholic Churches should be maintained. It declared that it is the mind of the Catholic Church that each individual church or rite should retain its traditions whole and entire, and likewise that it should adapt its way of life to the different needs of time and place, and that they should all preserve the legitimate liturgical rite in their established way of life, and these may not be altered except to obtain for themselves an organic improvement. It confirmed and approved the ancient discipline of the sacraments existing in the Eastern Churches, and the ritual practices connected with the celebration and administration, and declared its ardent desire that this should be re-established, if circumstances warranted. It applied this in particular to administration of sacrament of confirmation by priests. It expressed the wish that, where the permanent diaconate had fallen into disuse, it should be restored. Paragraphs 7 to 11 are devoted to the powers of the patriarchs and major archbishops of the Eastern churches, whose rights and privileges, it says, should be re-established in accordance with the ancient tradition of each of the churches and the decrees of the ecumenical councils, adapted somewhat to modern conditions. Where there is need, new patriarchates should be established, either by an ecumenical council or by the Bishop of Rome. Lumen Gentium. The Second Vatican Council's dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, deals with the Eastern Catholic Churches in paragraph 23, stating, "By divine providence it has come about that various churches, established in various places by the apostles and their successors, have in the course of time coalesced into several groups, organically united, which, preserving the unity of faith and the unique divine constitution of the universal church, enjoy their own discipline, their own liturgical usage, and their own theological and spiritual heritage. Some of these churches, notably the ancient patriarchal churches, as parent stocks of the faith, so to speak, have begotten others as daughter churches, with which they are connected down to our own time by a close bond of charity in the sacramental life and in the mutual respect for their rights and duties. This variety of local churches with one common aspiration is splendid evidence of the Catholicity of the undivided Church. In like manner, the episcopal bodies of today are in a position to render a manifold and fruitful assistance, so that this collegiate feeling may be put into practical application. Unitatis Redintegratio. The 1964 decree Unitatis Redintegratio deals with the Eastern Catholic Churches in paragraphs 14 to 17. Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches. The First Vatican Council discussed the need for a common code for the Eastern Churches, but no concrete action was taken. Only after the benefits of the Latin Church's 1917 Code of Canon Law were appreciated was a serious effort made to codify Eastern Catholic Churches' canon laws. This came to fruition with the promulgation of the 1990 Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches, which took effect in 1991. It is a framework document that contains canons that are a consequence of the common patrimony of the churches of the East. Each individual iuris church also has its own canons, its own particular law, laid on top of this code. Liturgical prescriptions. The 1996 instruction for applying the liturgical prescriptions of the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches brought together in one place the developments that took place in previous texts, and is an expository expansion based upon the canons, with constant emphasis upon the preservation of Eastern liturgical traditions and a return to those usages whenever possible, certainly in preference to the usages of the Latin Church. However much some principles and norms of the conciliar constitution on the Roman Rite, in the very nature of things, affect other rites as well. The instruction states, the liturgical laws valid for all the Eastern Churches are important because they provide the general orientation. However, being distributed among various texts, they risk remaining ignored, poorly coordinated and poorly interpreted. It seemed opportune, therefore, to gather them in a systematic whole, completing them with further clarification. Thus, the intent of the instruction, presented to the Eastern Churches which are in full communion with the Apostolic See, is to help them fully realize their own identity. The authoritative general directive However, this instruction, formulated to be implemented in Eastern celebrations and liturgical life, articulates itself in propositions of a juridical pastoral nature, constantly taking initiative from a theological perspective. Past interventions by the Holy See, the instruction said, were in some ways defective and needed revision, but often served also as a safeguard against aggressive initiatives. These interventions felt the effects of the mentality and convictions of the times, according to which a certain subordination of the non-Latin liturgies was perceived toward the Latin Rite liturgy, which was considered ritus praestantior. This attitude may have led to interventions in the Eastern liturgical texts which today, in light of theological studies and progress, have need of revision, in the sense of a return to ancestral traditions. The work of the commissions, nevertheless, availing themselves of the best experts of the times, succeeded in safeguarding a major part of the Eastern heritage, often defending it against aggressive initiatives and publishing precious editions of liturgical texts for numerous Eastern churches. Today, particularly after the solemn declarations of the Apostolic Letter Orientalium Dignitas by Leo XIII, after the creation of the still active Special Commission for the Liturgy within the Congregation for the Eastern Churches in 1931, and above all after the Second Vatican Council and the Apostolic Letter Oriental Lumen by John Paul II. Respect for the Eastern liturgies is an indisputable attitude, and the Apostolic See can offer a more complete service to the churches.